Welcome back to another episode of the Still Curtain podcast. I'm your host, Tommy Jaggi, editor of StillCurtain.com. Joining me today is my co-host, Shayne Kubas, a contributor for Still Curtain. Shayne, how's it going today?
Pretty good. Obviously, going to talk a lot about cuts and everything and talk about who, at least right now, we'll see how long it lasts for, but made the Steelers for 2022.
Yeah, one of the most exciting parts of the NFL season, I feel like, is that precursor right there when we cut down from 80 players down to 53, all in like a 24-hour period. There's a lot going on, glued to Twitter the whole time. So definitely a lot to talk about today in terms of cuts. Shayne and I will share our thoughts. We'll share the players that we got right, the players that we missed, and then what we would have done maybe a little bit differently than what the Steelers did. But first, we want to talk about the Steelers' preseason finale against the Lions. It's an exciting preseason this year, wouldn't you say, Shayne? I mean, as far as preseasons go, a lot of things to look forward to, a lot of young guys to watch.
Yeah, I mean, it was a really fun preseason. You know, obviously going 3-0 is always nice too, not losing the preseason, although it doesn't matter. We know that there's really no correlation, but winning a game is always better than losing in general. I'm sure a lot of coaches feel that same way, but it's definitely more important about, getting guys playing time, seeing what you have, and the rookies especially, and just getting a chance to see guys fight for their job, literally. Like, you get to see it in real time, and it's definitely an interesting dynamic with the NFL.
Yeah. Okay. Last week, we saw just like an abysmal performance by the offensive line in general. So we were hoping to see much better play this past week against the Lions. It was better, but it was not as encouraging probably as what we would want it to be. Like, I still feel like Dan Moore struggled a little bit. I thought that Mason Cole, even though he was all right in the first couple of games, he kind of had a letdown game here. Kendrick Green again. So, I mean, we have a right to be worried about this offensive line, don't we?
For sure. And I think that the thing that's a concern for me more so, and luckily it got a little bit better this past week, was the signings. Like Mason Cole did have a pretty strong start to the preseason. This game was a little bit of a step back, like you mentioned. And James Daniels did improve, which is good to see. He's a guy that obviously you hope can be kind of the anchor as a young piece that you brought in. So that was nice to see. But yeah, more with the penalties. And that was really the story of the offensive line. This game was more penalties and less just purely bad play, especially as the game went on. They started to kind of pick it up, but early it was definitely kind of rough to watch.
Yeah, the penalties were definitely drive killers. Not as many like ugly snaps overall that we saw against Jacksonville. Like, that game was just brutal to watch. But I was still, I was banging the table for the offensive line to stick in there for like three quarters of the whole game. Like, I want to see that unit start to mesh and start playing much better football. So I think they could use a lot more reps. We're going to have a task on our hands in week one on the road against Cincinnati. And I think that Dan Moore is going to have his hands full against Trey Hendrickson. We'll talk about that more, I'm sure, next week. But yeah, it's not as encouraging of a summer for the offensive line as what we would have liked it to be. Let's talk about Trubisky for a minute. He finished the game pretty strong. He had that 2-minute drive, went down, scored the touchdown. Prior to that, it was just like one field goal after the next. Couldn't really capitalize on opportunities. I don't really know if it was Trubisky's fault, but what was your feel for his performance in this preseason finale?
I think overall, I think that he had a really nice day. You do have to kind of look at the offensive line and the penalties, kind of stalling drives as a big reason why it took until that 2-minute drill to end the half to get a touchdown. But in general, he didn't do anything that makes me go, wow, I don't know if he can go out there week one. And that's kind of what you were looking to see if he would show some of that. That kind of has led to him needing a second chance here with the Bills first last year, now Pittsburgh. But he didn't really see that. I think in general, he played within himself. He didn't really do anything that was, risky or something that was just plainly bad to do in general. And you look at his numbers, look really good. Obviously, it's preseason. Some of that was against, not the starters for the Lions. But in general, his decision-making, I think, has been really good this preseason. And that was the most worrying thing about him going into the year.
Yeah, I think what I'm impressed by, too, is he's not just dinking and dunking the ball down the field. And that's kind of more of like what I expected to see from Trubisky. But he's making plays. I mean, 8.4 yards an attempt this game. He had 9 yards an attempt, I think, in the first week against the Seahawks. And so definitely some encouraging signs there from him. Certainly did enough, I feel like, to go. I know people they're scratching for a reason to get Kenny Pickett out there for week one. And I understand that. Like, I want Pickett to be able to play as soon as possible. I mean, he's the guy they drafted 20th overall. He's the guy that's going to be the future of the team. But I don't think that Trubisky certainly did anything to hurt his stock this summer. He finished with a strong preseason. And so let's just kind of go over like who should be that guy. Did Trubisky do enough in the preseason to be that week 1 starter?
I think that's where the conversation gets a little bit interesting for me and for a lot of fans, right? Because I do think Trubisky, both in camp from what I've heard and seen and from what he's shown in the preseason, that he has earned the opportunity to be this team's starter. He's worked with the ones the entire time. He worked with the ones the entire last preseason game, despite there being conversation from Tomlin about maybe not having him play the whole time, getting Pickett in there as well. The fact that he played the whole first half and looked good doing so, I think kind of cements him as a starter, even if Tomlin hasn't said so yet. But I do think Pickett at the same time has shown all the things that I would have wanted to see a rookie quarterback do well for me to trust him to go out there. So they have a problem on their hands where it's a good problem to have, in my opinion, because I don't think they're going to flip-flop guys early. I think they are going to pick a guy and let him see if he can be the guy before they make any changes. Because of that, and because of our schedule to start the year, I do think it's going to be Trubisky. I wouldn't be afraid to throw Pickett out there, though, from what he's shown.
Yeah, and I think that that's going to be the case as well. And it kind of comes back to like what we were talking about in previous weeks, which is I just feel like it's so hard to go back the other way. Like if you're to name Kenny Pickett the starter from week 1, it's kind of just like a tearing down his confidence a little bit. If you're to say, all right, you struggled the first couple games, we're going to pull you, put the veteran back in. And then when you show that you're actually ready, we'll put you back in the lineup. And so I just don't think that's the way to approach it at all. I think you're better to err on the side of caution, let the veteran play it out, let him take his lumps with an offensive line that's trying to gel and get better. Right. And so, like we said, we don't want to wish harm on Trubisky, but if anybody's going to be out there, we trust him. He's the veteran. If he can probably live through that in the poor offensive line play, if that is to be the case. But I really don't want to throw Pickett out there to the wolves to begin with. I think they both had comparable preseasons is how I would probably put it. I think they were both comparably good. Pickett's maybe more impressive than Trubisky's because he's doing it as a rookie. These are his first 3 exhibition games of his career. But I think Pickett did enough to keep that job, to start the season off as a starter at least. And we'll kind of just see how it goes from there. And we're hoping it doesn't take him too long. But again, if Trubisky is the Steelers starter by midseason, it probably means that he's doing something right. And the Steelers are winning football games.
Right, for sure.
So let's talk about the Lions game just a little bit more here. Who else stood out to you from that game in a positive or negative light?
I think from that game, I did like what I saw from James Daniels finally, and that was something I've been waiting for to see from him. And the whole offensive line has talked about the transition to the new offensive line coach, and especially for the new guys coming in, it was going to be a transition no matter what. Dealing with hand placement, how he wants them to handle certain pass sets, all that's starting to come around a little bit for some of the guys. Obviously, Daniels, you hope would be able to do that because he is a veteran. More, obviously, we'll see how he works through his struggles throughout the season, most likely. But Daniels was a guy that I was really glad to see kind of put up a good performance, and I'm hoping he can be that inside anchor for the team this year.
Yeah, James Daniels, I thought, really took a big step forward in that third game. Like he was doing enough to make us just a little bit nervous in those preseason games. And I didn't think the overall sample was horrible, but he had some really rough pass sets there. But I think he really cleaned that up this past week. I know he graded out well, according to Pro Football Focus, like a 78 grade or something, which is good for an offensive lineman, and particularly a Steelers offensive lineman. They're kind of strangers to that over the last few years. And so I still think that James Daniels is going to be a solid addition. Yeah. Like what I saw from him in this week. So I agree with you there. Kendrick Green, it was rough going again. And that's become the norm with him, unfortunately. But I saw the preseason grades just this morning. I tweeted it out. He had a 17.7 pass block grade in this game. That is low. That is low. And I'm not sure which other alignment you can put in there around the league and expect that type of output. And it's been for like 3 straight weeks now. It's been just kind of an embarrassment on his part. And so we'll talk about him a little bit more when we do the roster. But it's not ideal. Not exactly what you want to see that in that way for sure. So let's talk about our winners from the preseason overall, not just this last game. But who would you say are your winners overall from the 2022 preseason for the Steelers?
For me, it's the quarterback room in general, because I think even outside of, kind of like a throw in at the end of the half or the end of the fourth quarter for Rudolph last week, all the quarterbacks did relatively well. Especially, you see what you got from Pickett. Trubisky proved himself as a starting caliber player. Rudolph had apparently trade interests, which is very interesting to me considering what he's shown in the past. The whole quarterback room in general did a really good job, and by proxy, the entire receiving room for the most part also really impressed me. Even guys like Tyler Vaughns, who didn't make the team, even like Tyler Snead had some moments. There's guys here that, and we ended up keeping a lot of them. We'll talk about that when we get to the roster. All these receivers played up to par, and they showed that they at least belong on an NFL field. And I think that's going to be really good for, obviously, if injuries happen, if we want to throw in some different wrinkles, if we want to use some of these guys in certain packages, we have a ton of guys to go to as we try to build up this passing game over time.
Yeah, no argument there at all. Quarterbacks look good, receivers look good, and deep, I might add as well. And that's without Anthony Miller, him landing on IR before he even got started there, really. And so I definitely agree there. I would also add just the rookies in general.
Yeah, the rookies in general, for sure.
I mean, we talked about Kenny Pickett, George Pickens, both of those guys, really impressive preseasons, obviously. I thought DeMarvin Leal did really good as a pass rusher, at least. He has some things to work on in terms of run defense and holding up at the point of attack. But man, he's got a nasty spin move and dip inside like that. So I was impressed with what I've seen from him there. Mark Robinson, cracking that roster. And not surprisingly either, based on the way that he played. He's got that dog in him. He's physical. And I thought he proved himself both in run defense and on special teams. And then I would add undrafted rookie Jalen Warren as well, who had a very strong preseason. The running game wasn't exactly where Steelers wanted to be, but that was all around. I mean, Najee included this last game. Yeah. So there's that as well. But I would also say I would add in there Trey Norwood. I think
he had an excellent camp and
particularly in that first game too. Like targeted 4 times, didn't allow a reception, 2 pass breakups. One of them was in the end zone. I didn't think he was quite as strong these last 2 games, but you can still just see how he can be a versatile asset in that secondary. And I think part of the reason why he becomes a winner of the preseason is, unfortunately, Demonte Kazee knocked out for a little bit. And that's not something that we want to see, but it might increase Norwood's role as that dime defender, and he could be seeing the field more often than we initially anticipated there. Any more winners you want to touch on?
Really, you did already mention like Jalen Warren being presumably the number 2 back, looking at the roster right now with Snell as the special teams guy. He definitely is the guy that I wasn't sure who it would be, but I really had a strong feeling between him and some of the other undrafted backs like Mateo Durant and guys like that one of them would emerge as a better option for the true backup to Najee. And seeing him do that was big for this team, especially if God forbid Najee gets hurt. Don't want to have to deal with that, but at least we have somebody who showed that they have the physicality and the grit as a runner too.
Warren was definitely encouraging, so I'm interested to see what we get from him this year. I know it's going to be Najee carving out a bulk of the carries, and so if he gets a couple touches a game, then that'll be a bonus. But I'm interested to see what we have in him. All right, let's talk about the losers from Steelers 2022 preseason. Definitely some guys we can talk about in this regard too. It wasn't all sunshine and rainbows. So who were the losers this year?
I mean, I want to start with Devin Bush. Like we saw it last year, and I wanted to go into this year and say, hey, he's coming off an ACL. Clearly the team in general is kind of struggling in front of him with the D-line depth and injuries. And I wanted to give him the benefit of the doubt because he's such a talented player. He was coming out. There's a reason why the Steelers felt highly enough to go up to 10 and get him. And it just seems like all those things that made him a special player, made him a special prospect to me, are gone. The physicality is not there. The instincts aren't there as a runner or a run game guy especially. He just doesn't have any of the attributes that I wanted him to show in the NFL. And I don't know what his value is as a starter at this point. I don't think he does anything good enough to justify being a starting inside linebacker in the NFL.
Yeah, I stand by what I said last week on the show, and that is I don't think that he's the same player that we watched in college. No. Like he played with so much more tenacity. Yes. He was flying around the field, locating the football. He just doesn't play that way at all right now. And he did have the really nice 4th down stop. And I went back and I watched that play from several different angles and seeing him, he just darted right in there, made the play in the backfield. That's the kind of stuff that he's got to do more often. He's got to just attack, because if you take that fourth down stop away, it was not a good preseason from Devin Bush. It was not at all what we wanted to see. He was very timid. He looked like he was a second late getting to the play. He was washed in the run game. He gave up easy catches in the passing game. And so just more of the same from him. And we don't really know what's going to happen there. But, I mean, I'm assuming Bush is going to get that starting job next to Jack at the beginning of the season. It's just a matter of time, though. Like, if he keeps playing like this, the team's not going to be able to justify keeping him out there on the field if he proves to be a liability. So definitely agree with you there. We already talked about the offensive line in this last game. The offensive line as a whole, I thought, has been quite a mess. And I think it got slightly better. I would say a step in the right direction, or at least a little bit in this final game. But again, two players that really had me worried there was Kendrick Green, which unfortunately he's not going to be part of that starting unit anymore. Right. It looks like that's going to be Kevin Dotson. And Dotson's not perfect. He's got a lot of work to do too. He needs to help out a little bit more. And he had a couple whiffs in the run game. Mm-hmm. But Dan Moore, I feel like if we're talking about one player on each side of the ball, this is the most worrisome. Devin Bush, we just talked about. Dan Moore, the blindside protector for the Steelers. I mean, this guy has got to take that Okorafor next step forward in his progression, and we just didn't see as much of that as we'd hoped for, especially for a player that is at such an important position.
And that's the biggest concern for me is, like, I liked some of the things I saw from Moore last year. I understood why he ended up being the guy left tackle when you go back and look at everything. But he hasn't shown to me that he's improved enough in any one area to really give me hope that he's going to be the future left tackle of this team. He's probably going to end up being, you hope a guy like him, you'd hope to be a swing tackle, a guy who could probably play both sides, good enough in the run game, pass games, iffy pass protection, but you can get by with it like they did last year. Him being the true starting left tackle right now could very well spell some bad plays in this season simply because of his inability to protect the edge.
Yeah, and I was on board with Dan Moore as a fourth-round pick. I think that it was a solid selection. It's just that you don't want to ideally have to throw that guy into one of the most difficult roles in the NFL as that blindside protector right from day one. I hope he can continue to progress, and hopefully we see it throughout the season. What we need to see, though, is from week 1 to week 18, this guy needs to look like a lot different player, right?
Yes,
if we want to have – he's the cornerstone to this offensive line at the moment, and we don't know how long his tenure with the Steelers is going to be, but this is a huge year for him. He really needs to show that he can handle himself in that role. And I would also say for losers, I would throw in the Steelers rushing attack too.
Yes,
100%. Like, outside of that first game, those last two games were rough. Like, even Najee couldn't get anything going at all. And again, it rarely comes down to the running backs didn't execute what they were supposed to do. It's almost always seems it's like the issue with the offensive line. And there just was not a lot of lanes there. So that's something that's a little bit worrisome, especially for a team that is going to rely so heavily on the run game this year. But we would have liked to see the running game turn out a little bit better in those last two games. I got it pulled up right here against the Jaguars. The Steelers averaged 1.7 yards per carry in this past week against the Lions, 2.9 yards a carry. So far, far less than ideal, especially when other teams are still running for 4.5, 5 yards a carry on the Steelers defense, which is something that they'll need to address as well.
Yeah, I think the rushing offense in general, like, obviously it's kind of hard to judge. Najee only played one half of football this preseason because of his injury to his foot. The backup running backs aren't, like, especially Warren, he doesn't have a ton of physical talent, so he's not going to be able to make up for as much of bad blocking as a guy like Harris can. So the blocking definitely has to improve to just give these guys a chance. I mean, that's just kind of what it comes down to. If they can't open up at least some semblance of consistency with holes and places to go, none of these guys, even Najee, are going to be efficient, especially. They might get it done, but it's not going to be with any explosive plays or any sort of efficiency.
Yeah, and you could see in the first week, even though the offensive line really struggled with pass protection, the run blocking was there at least.
It was.
And McFarland was able to spring a few big runs. He averaged 8 yards a carry in that game. Jalen Warren averaged 5.7 a carry. And so you just give these guys a little bit of a crease there. Allow them to do something to get going, because these past two preseason games, there's just been no running room at all. And it's really hard to put that on the running backs. It's the offensive line's got to get that push. And so that's something we're looking to see. All right, let's shift gears here. We're going to talk about the Steelers. They finalized their 53-man roster by 4 p.m. on August 30th. all of the NFL teams need to get their rosters from 80 players down to 53. I think Steelers cut to the tune of like 27 or 29 players total.
Yeah.
I added them up, and there was a few weird things happening in there. But there's a lot of players. Over 24 players are now no longer with the team. Some of them have already been re-signed to the practice squad, with more coming on the way.
Yep.
But we're going to go position by position now, and we're going to talk about the Steelers' decisions and who they decide to keep for each position. So let's start with quarterback. Shane, no surprise at quarterback, right?
No, I mean, there was some rumors about maybe Mason Rudolph was on the trade block and teams might be interested in him, but at least so far, nothing's materialized there. I think that the Steelers probably would want something like a 4th-round pick or better to move him, just because he's such a good presence to have, especially him as a third quarterback. Feel much better about that than him being even a backup, even though I think he's fine as a backup too. So he gets to be the third guy. Pickett, presumably, we'll see what the decision ultimately is, but presuming that Pickett's the backup and then Trubisky goes in the season as a starter, pretty much exactly what we expected going into the season.
Yeah, these were the 3 from the beginning. Are the Steelers being way too stingy when it comes to Mason Rudolph? They're not going to get a 4th-round pick for that guy, but would they take less? He's your third quarterback on your team. If Pickett gets the job as the number 2 guy, which we expect him to do,
right?
Unless the Steelers like Rudolph better as a guy that can come in a pinch,
maybe.
I don't know. That's yet to play out. But if Pickett or if Rudolph, is going to be that guy that stands on the side with a clipboard and doesn't have a helmet, what's the sense of keeping around? I mean, they're living in their fears. I feel like that Tomlinism there, but from 2019, they had this scenario play out. And so I feel like that's coming back to haunt them right now. And they're not willing to take draft capital for a guy that is very unlikely to see the field this year. So, I mean, what would you take for him?
I think I would be willing to take even a 5th or 6th because, again, he's not going to, at least barring something unexpected happening, he's not going to play an actual role for you in terms of on the field. Now, I don't know how much that he plans on trying to help the other guys. I don't know how much he's already done that. I haven't been part of those meetings, obviously. But unless he's really been a huge help to both Trubisky and Pickett in this process, I don't see the value of keeping him on the team right now if you can actually get something for him. Now, if you get like a conditional 7th or something like that's a throwaway pick, then I might be understanding if you're just keeping him as a third quarterback. But if you can get a real draft pick in the mid rounds, like a 5th or 6th, that's probably enough for me just to say, we'll take our chances on if we need to bring back somebody. Even I know Ludukun, I think or Oldokin, he ended up going with the Chiefs, or he was visiting with them. I don't think he signed or anything.
Yeah, he did sign with their practice squad.
But did he practice squad? Okay. Mm-hmm. So if you have to go sign him off for practice squad, if you have to go find a third quarterback, there's guys out there that can be the third quarterback, especially, or a second quarterback if something happens to one of these 2 guys. So,
yeah, I mean, that's the part that we don't see. We don't know how Mason Rudolph is in the locker room. We don't know what kind of work he does to get that he will do, I should say, to get Trubisky or Pickett prepared for football games. And if he has a big hand in that, then it's worth keeping him around. But I agree with you, just looking at it as on the whole, and you got a 3rd-string quarterback who we've seen him in NFL action where it's nothing particularly impressive. And he's in a contract year. I mean, the Steelers, they could use draft capital. They trade draft capital away all the time. They've already done it twice this year,
especially late round picks. So
yeah, they could. And so that's something that they should definitely weigh for sure. They're not going to get a 4th if that is indeed what they're looking for. They should consider at least taking something after that, unless they think that Rudolph is really worth it because he helps get the other quarterbacks prepared. So yeah, no surprises there at the quarterback position. Those were the 3 that we thought all along. Like we said, last week, barring a Mason Rudolph trade, that was who it's going to be, and that's who it was. So let's look at running back. For the Steelers, the running backs that made the team this year are Najee Harris, no surprise, Benny Snell, and Jalen Warren. And so Anthony McFarland is the odd man out. What do you think about that?
I think it's tough because we all know, despite our feelings about Snell, we know why he's on the team still. It's a special teams value. Tomlin really likes him. So I did expect him to make the team, but I did have a feeling that maybe because of the fact that having Warren as the true backup as an undrafted rookie, I didn't know if they'd feel super good about that. So because of that, I felt like they might keep all 4 of these guys because McFarland especially gives them a completely different type of look at running back compared to Harris and Warren and Snell, of course.
Mm.
And having all 4 of them allows Snell to be a true just special teamer guy. He doesn't have to be on offense really at all unless he has to for a pinch. And you have a guy who's a direct backup to Harris and how he plays with Warren, and then a true scat back or change of pace guy in McFarland. But apparently they didn't feel that was necessary to do.
Yeah, I can't say that I'm particularly surprised the Steelers gave up on McFarland. This is a guy that had 3 carries on 108 offensive snaps last year. So they just didn't give him the ball anyway. But I was hopeful. I was hopeful this year. I saw a lot from him. Even when I was down there in Latrobe myself and watching him play, I thought he took a big step up as both a runner and a receiver. Blocking's never going to be his game. And so that's just something that he's always going to struggle with. And he did a little bit in the preseason as well. But I thought that he showed some flashes. I mean, he busted off that 26-yard run in the first week. And I thought that he looked pretty good overall as a runner, especially when you compare it to the other group of guys. And nobody these last 2 games was able to run particularly well. But he brought that element that none of the other running backs on the roster have, and that is true breakaway speed. I mean, this guy is true 4.4 speed. If there's a crease, he has the chance to take it to the house. And unfortunately, we didn't get to see that during his NFL career. We saw it a lot from him at Maryland. If you go look at his Ohio State tape, it's remarkable what he was able to do in that game. And so I was hoping that we would be able to see something like that, especially now that Canada hopefully is running the full brunt of his offense now. But apparently he just didn't do enough in the Steelers' eyes to keep him around. He didn't offer anything on special teams like what Benny Snell did. And I think that's the ticker right there. Right. And if you flip that around, if McFarland's the special teams ace and Benny Snell doesn't offer anything there, then the choice is made the other way. But I think it's because of special teams that Snell's going to be around. Now I'm just interested to see who comes in after Najee. Who do you think is going to be? Do you think it's going to be Snell or Warren?
I really hope it's Warren, and we've talked about I just don't think Snell brings anything as a runner at the NFL level. I just don't think he's a true caliber running back as far as NFL speed, NFL play. He doesn't even really run through people the way you'd hope a guy like him would do. Warren showed a lot more grit and toughness as a runner than I've ever seen from Snell just in this preseason. So for me, I would definitely have Warren be the true backup to Najee. If someone's going to spell him, especially, or if someone has to come in for significant snaps, I do think it has to be Warren.
Yeah, and Warren's not known as an athlete either, but you just put on the tape side by side, you can see that he's got significantly more burst and quickness than what Snell does as well. So I'm hoping that's the case as well. Like I said, it's probably just going to be a few touches here and there for whoever it is, and maybe they use a combination of both. I wouldn't be surprised if by the end of the season, if their snaps look kind of similar. So we'll see. I'm hoping that it's Warren that overtakes that as well. And I would also add in here too, we won't spend time talking about a fullback, but Derek Watt obviously made the team as a Steelers fullback, family ties, special teams guy. And so no big surprise there. All right, let's shift over to talking about the wide receiver position. This one caught me off guard, and I think it did with everybody. The last couple of years, the Steelers have only kept 5 receivers on their roster heading into the season. I predicted them to keep a 6th, and I think you did too, right?
We had the same 6, I believe. Yeah,
we had the same 6. We did not know that the Steelers were going to keep a 7th, and I would venture a guess that if you ask anybody else out there in the business, they wouldn't have guessed that either. And so it's interesting. And I have a thought on that as well, but go ahead and tell me what you think about the 7 that made the team for the Steelers.
I think all 7 of these guys, including even maybe a guy or 2 that didn't make the team, all played at a level that would warrant a roster spot in the NFL this preseason. And we talked about it in the winners and losers of the preseason. This receiving core really got it done. They really did a really good job. I mean, we could talk all day about how good Deontay is. We know already with him. Claypool is the slot receiver this year. I think is going to take a big step forward. And then the star of NFL training camp preseason, George Pickens, of course. You have to talk about him, of how well he played and what he did for us. Austin, unfortunately, didn't get a chance to play in the preseason because of an injury, and we'll talk more about that. I know that's one of the things you want to talk about, but he's obviously going to make the team as a 4th-round pick, guy with a ton of speed, separation ability, special teams possible value in the future. Gunnar Olszewski, he was going to make the team. We kind of knew that with his special teams ability as a returner. And then Boykin and Sims both, I think, showed really good flashes as receivers and as kind of gadget guys, especially for Sims on his jet sweeps. And even in the return game a little bit, too. We have kind of 2 return guys that I think we could go to if need be.
Yeah, the 7 receivers is interesting because it makes me think that Calvin Austin is going to head to IR.
Right.
And
To
he's
start the
eligible to
season.
return after 4 weeks. And so that's probably the plan. I don't think they do that otherwise. I
No.
just don't see the role for Sims on that
No.
team really. And so
Unfortunately, no.
I think that'll end up being the case. Nothing is official yet. We do know that Austin's been nursing that injury and that he missed the entire preseason. And so they probably want some time to get him back up to speed and then maybe just keep Sims in the meantime. I have a feeling that he's going to be that guy that is then demoted once Austin comes back. That's just my prediction.
I would assume
so. We'll see if that comes to fruition. But I agree with you there. I think they all played pretty well. Boykin, I thought Boykin did a really good job both on offense and on special teams. And that guy was flashing all the time. And so I would have been interested to see, had Anthony Miller not got hurt, if he would have taken that spot from Sims. Or if he potentially would have been even over Boykin on the roster. I don't know. He was having a really good training camp with the Steelers. He was running with the first team offense early on. And so that's just another guy. It's such a deep receiving core. Like the Steelers have a couple of positions that are really deep, and the rest we would kind of like to add a little bit more talent to if we could. Receiver is one of those positions that is deep. And I feel bad for a guy even like Tyler Vaughns. Like there was never a chance that Vaughns was going to make the team because of the depth at the position. But he was like a second half phenom, like in those 3 preseason games. Like he would come on strong. And so I'll be interested to see if anybody has a plan for him or if he's just if Steelers will try to just stash him on the practice team yet.
I hope that they can get him back on the squad because he's a perfect guy to be able to bring up if you need someone who can just play a little bit, right? Like he showed that he can do some things, especially his ability to kind of turn up field after a catch was really strong. I really like the way he just kind of moves after he gets the ball in his hands. I think he'd be a really good player to bring up if you had an injury too, especially like if Claypool or Deontay gets hurt and you want to have somebody who can go out there and play multiple positions. I think he could definitely do that for you if need be.
Yeah, I know. That'll be interesting to see what they do with him there. And Vaughn's not a particularly great athlete, but the guy's still slippery after the catch somehow. For sure. He just has that little wiggle to him and looked very natural as a football player. So very, very interested to see 7 receivers make it. That caught both of us off guard here. And like we said, we think that it's probably temporary. We think this is probably a move just to get Calvin Austin onto IR, temporary IR first, miss the first 4 games, and then see if he's healthy enough to come back, and at which time the Steelers would probably drop down to 6 receivers at that point. Actually, they'll be at 6 receivers with Austin on IR, and then Sims would drop off the roster after that, is my prediction. Let's talk about tight ends for a minute. No big surprise here. Kevin Rader was on the roster as a third tight end last year. This year, he's beat out by rookie Connor Hayward. I think you and I both had that in our predictions, correct?
Yep. Yeah, we had the same tight end room for sure. And I think it makes a lot of sense. Like you have 2 true tight ends with Freiermuth and Gentry, and then you have a third piece who can kind of be moved around in Hayward, right? He can play traditional fullback. He can play an H-back role. He can play like a third tight end on the wing, move him around. Really caught the ball super well pretty much all preseason, which is that's what I wanted to see from him if he was going to make a transition to more of a true tight end move player kind of role. And he definitely showed that and earned his spot as a third tight end for sure.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see what Canada does, having this true H-back type. Certainly not like the other 2 tight ends at all. I think that Freiermuth is the well-rounded guy. Gentry is your Y tight end, the inline blocker. And so Connor Hayward definitely has a very different feel. Like you said, you can move around, do a lot of different things with him. I'm predicting a lot of 3 tight end sets this year. I'm just
they're very well good. Yeah,
I think that they're going to use that a lot, and he's a guy that could be utilized a little bit more than what some are anticipating, I think. And so it'll be interesting to see. I don't think he had a particularly great preseason. I think his summer overall was pretty good. Yeah, I didn't do necessarily anything to stand out too much in the preseason. Although he had a couple nice catches, but we'll see how he's utilized for the Steelers this year. If it's going to be primarily special teams, or if he'll be able to carve out a role on offense as well. All right, so no surprises there for us. Let's take a look at the offensive line. That one they threw a curveball at us. It's really not fair, is it, Shane? Like we can't predict who they're going to trade for.
That's the problem with this. Is like there's always some teams who kind of just they like their guys and they stay with it. They don't like to mess around too much, but I can't blame them for looking outside the organization. We kind of talked about it last week and in prior weeks that they probably need to do something to look at least bolstering depth, if not trying to find possibly replacements for starters. But they go out, obviously they keep, Moore, Dotson, Cole, Daniels, Okorafor, the starters right now. We knew those guys were going to be the starters, especially now that Green finally got demoted a little bit. Green makes the roster, which again, I expected it. I don't think he's earned it in any way, but I expected him as a third-round pick to make it. And then they go out and get Jesse Davis from the Vikings, formerly of the Dolphins, 72 career starts. Very, he's a veteran player. He's very experienced, but that experience isn't the best as far as on the field. So that's a bit of a concern for me. I know you kind of tweeted about it, talked about it. He is a good veteran piece to have because he can play multiple positions. He played 4 out of 5 last year, I think, for the Dolphins. So he has versatility, but versatility only gets you so far if you're not particularly great at any of those spots. So.
Yeah, I think that the two biggest things you can point to with Jesse Davis is, as you pointed out, he's got starting experience, he's got versatility. Other than that, you're not going to want to take too deep of a dive into his tape, or else you'll end up a little bit disappointed. I thought his tape at tackle is just it's cringeworthy at times, and particularly in pass sets. And I think he's a guy that you almost have to play as a backup guard. But then what are we doing here? Because Joe Hag is no longer on the team, and so who is the swing tackle if not Jesse Davis? Like, I think it has to be Davis, barring another signing, right?
It has to be him. Now. Yeah.
But I'm telling you guys, if you didn't like what you saw in Dan Moore, you're just gonna have to pray that guy stays healthy, because you're not gonna like what you see in Jesse Davis. That's some really, really rough tape there. I know that I saw some Miami fans actually were just hooting and hollering. They were so happy to get rid of him.
I have a lot of friends who are Miami guys, and they all were telling me, like, why did they trade for him? I'm like, they didn't give up much of anything. I think they just wanted another veteran that they felt they could trust that has some starts under his belt. And they're like, yeah, but he's worse than what you already have. And I'm like, well, if he's the backup guard, it'd be different. But I do agree, at tackle, he's definitely not better than what we have. So
yeah, and we'll see if he can turn anything around. Chances are, being almost 31 years old, he's probably the player that he's going to be.
Yes, I would say.
But again, very low risk trade. And so if he turns out to be serviceable, it's okay. To me, is like Joe Hag was a better swing tackle in my mind anyway. I think I trust him a little bit more. I don't think that I don't want him coming in at left tackle for like a 3-game stretch, but I do think that Hag has experience there as well. They're both seasoned veterans. I don't know how I feel about that one. I'm not crazy about it. And then let's talk about Green for a little bit here, because a lot of fans were upset. There was a legitimate debate here, and I think that it's justified.
Yes. Kendrick
Green or John LeGlue. And in one hand, you've got the 3rd-round pick, who has just been utterly disappointing in his first 2 seasons. The other hand, you have a guy that it's not like he deserves to be a starter, an undrafted guy at Tulane in 2019, but a guy that came in for 5 starts last season for the Steelers. And I thought he did a pretty respectable job. They had some successful run games when he was in there, nothing crazy. And he had a couple nice preseason games. So did the Steelers make the right decision? Let me ask you it this way. Okay. If both of these guys were undrafted, who makes the team?
Oh, LeGlue makes it. No, there's no shot. Like, and it comes down to the fact that, like, we have tape on Green as a starting player in the NFL, and we also have 5 games of LeGlue last year. And you can't tell me that you go back and look at those two. And I know that they played different positions last year, and you can whatever. You can't tell me that LeGlue didn't look more like an NFL player than Green did. Not only then, but so far in this process up to this point. And I understand you don't want to give up on an athletic guy, a 3rd-round pick. You don't want to give up on him after a year. But we just saw what the Raiders did with Alex Leatherwood. They gave up on him as a 1st-round pick after 1 season. If you make a mistake, it is better in the NFL especially to just go ahead and say, hey, we made a mistake. Let's make sure we're the best 53 players on this team. If you're not one of them, I don't care what your draft capital is. I don't care if we have to lose money on it. That's the attitude I think you have to try to bring as much as you can. Now, if it's a guy who you think has issues that can be rectified and it's something that is just not happening yet, but you want to be the team to take a chance on them still, I understand that. With Green, I don't know, especially in this system. It'd be different if he was playing like a Shanahan scheme where he could be on the move as like a center. He might have more playability there. As a guard in this scheme, I just don't think he brings enough physicality and strength to any part of his game.
Yeah, that one is, I mean, it's directly tied to draft capital. I love the Steelers as an organization, but they do have an issue when it comes to pride. And I feel like they're not willing to give up on players who are so blatantly bad. Like, this is not a surprise we saw coming. You watched Kendrick Green in the one-on-one drills during training camp. He was just humiliated by players who shouldn't even be better than what he is, but like Carlos Khalil Davis putting him on his butt. And so it's just not what you want to see at all from a player who was a former 3rd-round pick. And I agree with you. If it was a level playing field and both of those guys were undrafted free agents, I think that Leglue is the guy that makes the team. I think that he's the better player. And I know that the Steelers don't like to use analytics, and people will argue with this, but John Leglue is 6'7", 315. Kendrick Green is 6'1" and 7/8 and 305 pounds. It makes a difference how big you are on the offensive line, especially if you're playing that guard position. According to Mock Draftable's database, Kendrick Green is smaller than 99% of NFL guards that have come into the league since 1999. That is what you call an outlier. Yes. And outliers like James Harrison, who is also an outlier. Outliers don't always work out. They're called outliers for a reason, because once in a blue moon, you get a guy that goes against the grain and that can find success there. I don't think that Kendrick Green is going to be that guy. Not based on what we saw.
Yeah, from what he has not shown me anything for me to feel like that he can beat the expectations of his size and strength profile. I just don't see it.
Yeah, and it's now that he has made the final 53-man roster, the Steelers have already made a trade for another offensive lineman. I see him sticking there probably this year at least. But I mean, if Dotson or Daniels gets hurt and he has to come in and he looks bad for a couple games, I mean, I don't think it'll be too long before they give up on him. He's kind of in that same boat with Devin Bush. Hasn't been around as long, but just what we've seen is just looks so sloppy. And so that was an interesting decision. Not a surprising one. Shane and I both had him making the roster, obviously, in our prediction, 3rd round pick, and we knew that would be the Steelers' logic behind it. But again, I think that that's a position that we got to be a little bit worried about. We got to make sure Dotson is a guy that can't stay healthy. I mean, that's what we've seen his first 2 years. And so if Dotson goes down, or hopefully he doesn't struggle, because if at any point, if you have to turn to Kendrick Green, your team's in trouble.
Yeah, it's that point. Yeah. And I think that I will be interested to see as far as Haig goes. I wonder if once we do open up a roster spot with KZ going on IR and then also putting Austin on IR, if that's what happens with him, do they bring back a guy like Haig? Is that maybe their plan is to try to bring him back as a 9th offensive lineman to be the true swing tackle? That would be, I think, a good idea if they can pull that off. And then Leglue going on the practice squad, if Green does have to come in for injury and he is as bad as he's been, maybe then they do move him up to the active roster and do something with Green at that point. So.
Yeah, and that was the big thing with the offensive line. Like, I did not want Trent Scott. I did not want Chaz Green. I've seen those guys enough, and they're not good football players either in respect. I mean, they're NFL athletes, but obviously compared to the players that play the same position they do, I don't think those guys were worthy of making NFL rosters at this point in their careers. But I'm also not crazy about Jesse Davis. So we'll see how that goes and what the plan is there. We just got to really hope that those offensive tackles and the guards stay healthy, because
hold up. Yeah.
The depth is a little bit scary after that. And I will mention as well that JC Hofstenauer made the team. I don't know if we talked about JC yet.
Not much. We know. I mean, he's a backup center. He's fine. He can come in if need be. I'm not really worried about him of all people. So maybe he even is a guy that maybe you ask to play guard if need be, if it really gets bad. So
and when JC Hofstenauer is the best, the best of your backups, you know you got issues. And so,
it's not great.
I don't love the Steelers starting lineup at the moment, at least, but we're going to really hope those guys stay healthy this year. Let's shift our focus to the defensive line. Actually, before I do that, let's make an announcement. If you are a fan of the Pittsburgh Steelers and you'd like to support the Steel Curtain podcast, please consider subscribing to the Steel Curtain podcast on YouTube. We appreciate your support. All right, let's shift gears here. Let's talk about the defense in the final 53 that made the roster. I got this one right.
I did.
Got 7 defensive linemen. Now, this is the first time I don't blame you for only predicting 6, because again, I went back and looked in the archives. It hasn't happened in 10 years. And so the Steelers went against the grain a little bit on this one, but they kept a 7th interior defender. And so the guys that they have on their roster right now, Cam Hayward, Larry Ogunjobi, Tyson Alualu, Chris Wormley, rookie DeMarvin Leal, Isaiah Loudermilk, and Montravius Adams probably is that 7th guy, the backup nose tackle to Tyson Alualu. What are your thoughts on that?
I'm definitely glad to be wrong, because I did not want to be right about that one. That was just kind of my feelings, based on my feelings about the running back room and them keeping 6 receivers. I kind of had a feeling somewhere someone was going to get moved that probably doesn't deserve it. Luckily, Adams does make the team, and the rest of the guys, obviously, we talked about. We know this is one of the strengths of our team, right? We look at receiver, you look at defensive line. That's where our depth truly is, and it's not bad places to have depth, especially the defensive line. with the starters, we know who they're going to be. We know that Ogunjobi off the bench is going to be very good as well. If him and Warren Lee probably going to split time depending on situation stuff. Leal looked really good as a rookie. I think he can so far. Like, I think he'll have a role as a pass rusher occasionally, especially if something does happen to a guy like Ogunjobi, who he's mainly a pass rusher, so that might be his role to back him up in case of an injury. Loudermilk looked better than he did last year, I think, so far in the preseason. He had a good camp. He's beefed up. Like to see that. And then Adams luckily does make the roster as kind of like you said, that backup nose tackle to a guy who is, in his mid-30s, and we're not sure what we're going to get out of him. So,
yeah, so 7 for the first time in a decade. And I got all those right, and you just had Adams off of your roster in just a numbers game. And
exactly.
Again, the Steelers haven't done this in 10 years, which makes it unusual, kind of like the wide receiver position that we just talked about. But it also makes me wonder too, like, is the injury to either Loudermilk or Adams severe enough that maybe they would consider stashing one of these guys away for the 4-game IR and going back down to 6? I don't know. I really don't. I didn't think that their injuries were that severe, but
doesn't seem
that's a possibility that we might not be able to rule out either. But I'm excited for this depth on this team. Like this is an area where we went into last season not knowing if Stephon Tuitt was going to play. Obviously, he did not play at all, and he ended up ultimately retiring. Tyson Alulu was knocked out just after a game and a half and spent the last 15 games on IR. Carlos Davis got injured, and he was a guy that really could have had a chance to make his mark in the NFL. And I feel bad for him because now, like these last 3 guys that just missed the cut, Carlos Davis, Khalil Davis, both of those guys were draft picks 2 years ago. One of them was drafted by the Steelers, and Khalil, I think, was drafted by Tampa Bay, maybe.
Sounds right, yeah.
Yeah, and so they're late round draft picks, but they were athletic guys or guys that just blew us away at the combine. These twin brothers with how fast they were able to run these 40-yard dashes, and you can see that speed and twitch show up on film. And Henry Mondeau even. Like, I think that these guys, like if the depth wasn't so strong, I think all 3 of them are potentially good enough to be like that bottom of the roster guy on somebody else's team. It's just not going to happen in Pittsburgh. And so it's going to take a couple injuries for a guy like that to move back up. And I would expect probably 2 of those guys to be back on the practice squad. So we'll see what happens here soon.
For sure.
All right, let's look at the edge defender position. Again, they cheated on us, Shane. We would have had it right, I think. But the Steelers go and make a move that wasn't completely unexpected. I have to say that we did mention that there was a chance that the Steelers could go out and look for outside help. I didn't know if that would come with a signing or in waivers or in the form of a trade. And it was ultimately a trade for Malik Reed. And so give me your thoughts on him. Have you got a chance to dive into any of his tape yet?
So I haven't gotten a chance to look at him specifically as far as tape goes, but I am very familiar with him. This is a guy who's played a lot for Broncos the past 2 years, especially. I think 13 sacks for the past 2 years, been very productive as an edge rusher for them. And he's a different kind of edge rusher. He's not the biggest guy in the world, but he's very slippery, I think, as a pass rusher. He moves very well, even for his size, being a little bit of a smaller guy. And I think he is the kind of player that I'd like to have as a third edge rusher where he can kind of move him around a little bit. He's not super stiff because he is a smaller player. He can kind of do a little bit more for you. And he is a really good backup, especially to, so something happened with Highsmith, with him missing time. He would be, I think, a decent starter to put in across from Watt, who could at least bring some semblance of pressure, unlike some of the guys we have behind them.
Yeah, so it was Watt, Highsmith, Malik Reed, and Tuska that made the team before I go any farther. But we'll talk about Malik Reed a little bit more here. I haven't done a real thorough dive into his tape yet, but I was surprised by some of the things that I saw on him when I was doing a little bit of research. I knew he was a little bit smaller. I didn't realize he'd be 6'1", 234 pounds. So he's actually technically size-wise, he's smaller than Ryan Shazier was going into the 2014 NFL Combine. To put it into perspective, I don't think Shazier played at the 238 that he tested out. He probably played a little bit lighter than that. But it's interesting because Malik Reed is not big. His wingspan is really, really small, and so is his arm length when you compare it to other NFL edge defenders. And he did not test as a particularly good athlete either. He only ran a 4.85, a 31.5-inch vertical jump. And so what is his niche really like? But the guy manages to be productive still.
He does,
in Denver, he was. And so 13 sacks over the last 2 seasons, 8 sacks in 2020. And so definitely something, a little bit of something to look forward to. I think he can provide a spark off the bench. Certainly, we would have to agree that he would be an upgrade over Hamilcar Rashed, who couldn't make the Jets roster.
Mm-hmm.
And was pressing his luck with the Steelers. And who knows, Rashed is early in his career, but I'll take the guy with experience at this point. I mean, if Watt or Highsmith were to get injured, I think that could really spell disaster. It will anyway. If Watt goes down.
Right. Especially Watt, yeah. Especially Watt.
So, but it'll be interesting to see what kind of role he carves out. And maybe it'll be something where he can carve out a big enough chunk to actually give these guys like ample rest sometimes, allow them a series or two where they can just kind of kick their feet back and rest up a little bit. So that's what I'm hoping out of Malik Reed.
Absolutely. I think that his role is going to be obviously a third edge rusher. I'd like to see him kind of use it to me, like, especially with his size. I think that his biggest thing, and I've seen a few like highlights of his because I did watch a lot of Broncos games the past couple of years. I'm really interested by that team in general. And now obviously more so than ever with them bringing Wilson in, but it seemed like he's a very crafty guy, I feel like. And that's kind of what, when you don't have the size profile, when you don't have the athletic profile, you have to find other ways to win, right? And I think, he's developed some good pass rush moves. I saw there's one he's good inside out move where he'll kind of fake the inside rush and go back out where the tackle lunges forward for him. So, like, he's a crafty guy. I think he'll be able to be used in certain situations with the two of them on the field with Highsmith and Watt. And if he's asked to play a traditional, like, full-on 3-4 edge, like, I do think he has some limitations in the run game as well because he's not the biggest guy, but he would at least be better depth than we had, like you talked about.
Yeah, definitely agree with that. And again, we're talking about a late round pick swap. We get the 6th, we get Reed back in the Broncos 7th. It's not that big of a deal in the grand scheme of things. We're looking at a number of spots in positioning in draft capital. And to get a sizable upgrade, which we're hoping that's what he is over Tuska, which Tuska or Hamilcar Rashed that we didn't see much of during preseason at all. We're hoping we get the upgrade there. I know the Steelers cut Avery 2 weeks ago, Jannard Avery, but would you have rather had Avery in that role, or would you rather have Malik Reed just straight up?
I think from what I've seen, obviously Reed's been more productive, but I think Avery's probably a better fit as a true 3-4 edge. So it's tough. Like, Avery did look pretty good in the short amount of action he did get for us. So I think it's tough to say. Going with the guy that has more proven snaps and production over the past 2 years, though, it makes a lot of sense, especially for such a minimal draft capital cost.
Mm-hmm. And it's interesting because I've heard reports as well that the Steelers didn't like Jannard Avery's fit as that right side edge rusher there. But it's interesting because Malik Reed is even smaller than Avery is and not nearly the athlete. But I do think that he'll be able to offer something. I hope that we're pleasantly surprised by him. To me, it seems like kind of like a lesser version of like the Levi Wallace signing, because he's not going to be in nearly as big of a role, but that type of player, just the gritty, hard-nosed player that's the Tomlin type of guy. It seems like he likes those guys. He does not care about testing numbers at all when it comes to most positions, it seems. So there's your 4 edge rushers. Barring anything else, it's going to be Watt, Highsmith, Malik Reed, and Derek Tuska. And Tuska, again, is probably going to be that guy that contributes on special teams. And he'll probably be their 4th guy in the field there. All right, let's shift over and talk about the linebackers. I did get one of these wrong, and man enough to admit that. We had Jack, Bush, Spillane, Mark Robinson, and I also threw a 5th in there with Buddy Johnson. Johnson did not make the team. And so despite this being just his 2nd NFL season, entering his 2nd NFL season and being a 4th round pick and a 92 percentile athlete, none of that matters anymore because the Steelers apparently didn't think that he did enough to earn a roster spot this year. And so I'm interested to see what happens with Johnson. I don't think this is the end of his career. We definitely needed to see more from him. But he was, again, a guy that I thought at the very least could have been a developmental prospect because of the tools that he possessed. He's a pretty well-balanced skill set, just not enough in terms of like what we saw from instincts in attacking the football. But what are your thoughts on Mark Robinson making the team?
I'm really glad he did. And I think we both obviously really expected that just because he proved to be the one guy in the backups, especially who really has a physical presence and wants to attack downhill, has the size and athleticism moving forward, especially to do that. I think that he's the best chance they have to replicate what they had with Vince Williams, right? That's what the Steelers want. We know that that's the guy they want as a second linebacker, a guy who can come downhill, who can be a blitzer, who isn't afraid to get up in everyone's face and cause problems for the offensive line, especially in front of them. Like, that's the guy that they want. And Robinson did that better than anyone else in the preseason. Obviously, other than Miles Jack, he's going to be the true starter for us. But Robinson showed the most ability to do those things. So he was the lock for me, especially after the first 2 games. And then with Johnson, especially, I want to talk about him. I think that he is likely a practice squad guy for us specifically. I don't think another team will try to snipe him from us. But he does have the athleticism you'd want to see as a prospect. I think he has a chance to develop further. But I feel like they would rather go with Robinson, and then also Allen is likely going to be back. Marcus Allen will be back once they put KZ on IR. So he's a guy they trust as well. He's been there for longer. I think that they like the fact he's a little bit different than the other linebackers. So we'll see what happens with Johnson, but I do expect him to be back in some capacity.
Yeah, and Marcus Allen was that special teams ace. And so, again, Allen is not currently on the roster, but the plan supposedly is for the Steelers to re-sign Marcus Allen to the 53-man roster once they stash KZ on IR for right now. And so it's, I guess if we look at it that way, it's not too big of a surprise considering all the experience that Marcus Allen has in special teams as the up back for the Steelers in punt coverage. And so he can do a lot of things from that way, wear a lot of hats. But Allen has been nursing an injury in his own right, in which maybe is why they can get him right back. But he's been out with a hamstring, I believe, for weeks. And so we haven't seen him at all. So it's just interesting that they would choose an older, more injured, not just injured this year, but injury prone Marcus Allen. We've seen several injuries with him over the years. They would choose that over Buddy Johnson. It just makes me feel like they just didn't have much confidence that Johnson was really going to be that guy that they could count on. But I will be interested to see how things shape out with the rest of the linebackers. Like, Jack's going to be the guy that doesn't leave the field. I mean, he's going to be the guy, assuming he's healthy, he's going to be out there all the time. I'm not rooting for the demise of Bush or Spillane, but I think it's going to happen to those guys, whether we like it or not. But Bush is going to be probably the player that we've been seeing for the last year and a half or so. And Spillane is just going to be a guy that's just detrimental in coverage. And so it makes me wonder, as the season progresses, if Mark Robinson's going to be able to maybe inch his way up and carve out a little bit bigger role with them. I don't think he's going to be a guy that's particularly good in coverage either, but he has been impressive as a rookie. So that'll be interesting as well.
I think if the run defense by the middle of the season is still iffy at best, and the linebackers are a big part of why outside of Jack, don't be surprised if Robinson starts playing at least like 50% of the defensive snaps just to try to give them a boost there.
Yeah, I can see something like that happening for sure, especially the linebacker play we've gotten over the last couple of years. All right, let's look at the cornerback position. Making the roster, we have Ahkello Witherspoon, Cam Sutton, Levi Wallace, Arthur Millette, and James Pierre. Justin Lane and James Pierre were in a neck-and-neck battle each of the past 2 seasons. Last year, they kept both of them. This year, Lane is the odd man out. So we can officially say that was a busted 3rd-round pick, right?
Yeah, I mean, we've kind of known for a couple of years now that it didn't seem like Justin Lane was really going to ever figure it out as a player. You love the athleticism, the size, but again, you just couldn't really figure out how to play. And at least with Pierre, and we've talked about it before, I think when we did the roster predictions last week, I trust Pierre more in coverage in general than Lane, just because I think he's smart and he can do what he needs to do. Mm-hmm. It's just going to be protecting him from certain matchups and certain route combinations down the field. If you can prevent him from having to run and chase guys or go down the field vertically, he can cover short areas of the field in the red zone. I think he'll be a weapon somewhat. Outside of that, though, don't really want to see him out there. This is all about the top 3 guys have to stay healthy. If they stay healthy, I think they're at least an average corner room, which with our pass rush, if it works out, is really all they have to be. And anything less than that, it could become an issue, especially, again, if one of these guys does go down.
Yeah, and we talked about the offensive line being scary in terms of depth. The cornerback room is the same exact way. Shane and I were talking about this earlier. If Ahkello Witherspoon were to go down for like a 5 or 6 game stretch, we're in trouble. Like, we don't have any speed at corner. We don't have any length at corner. You are now forcing a player like James Pierre, Arthur Millette to come into the game and nickel and dime. And so we're going to have a really slow cornerback room out there, an undersized cornerback room. And the results, I can assure you, would not be ideal. And so that's theoretically, that's a position I would love to be able to add at least one more quality player there, bump everybody down a little bit more, probably where they should be. I'm okay with the Steelers' top 3 cornerback. We just got to make sure that they stay healthy this year, because it could be a disaster if any of those other players have to see the field for an extended period. Outside of Justin Lane, there's really nobody else that was even in contention really to make that roster. Maybe Chris Steele, who was running over Lane a little bit at the end, but I was never impressed by what I saw with Chris Steele, the undrafted rookie out of USC this year. I just didn't think that he had shown enough really. And so that one we predicted correctly, and it was pretty easy to see coming. And I think that those were going to be their 5, barring any other signings. All right, let's talk about the safety position. Making the roster for the Steelers this year, we have Minkah Fitzpatrick, Terrell Edmunds, DeMonte Kazee, Trey Norwood, and Miles Killebrew. Now, Kazee, we said he did suffer a serious wrist and arm injury. It was listed at during the preseason finale against the Lions. And so Kazee will be stashed on IR. And the hope that is he'll be ready to return at some point for the Steelers. It was looking like Kazee was going to be the primary backup at both free safety and strong safety for the Steelers. Am I right?
Absolutely. He's the guy that has experience as a deep safety, especially. I mean, he had a season with 7 interceptions as playing mostly that role, but he also has the physicality, despite his size, to be a strong safety in this scheme, I think, too, if anything happened to Edmunds, especially. But I think his value is definitely going to be as that third safety, where you can bring a guy like Edmunds into the box, let him help with run defense. You know, with Fitzpatrick and Kazee back there, a lot of range, the ability to cover deep for both of those guys. I wanted to see that, and not getting to see that package, not getting to have that as an option really makes the linebacker room that much more concerning, because now you might not have Edmunds there to help as much because he has to play back more. And in general, it just doesn't allow you to move guys around as much as you would have maybe liked to prior.
Yeah, it definitely hurts their flexibility just a little bit right there. And I'll go back to what I said before. I think that Trey Norwood suddenly becomes a winner here, because I think that he might be that guy that's asked to back that up. I don't know if he can back up the strong safety position. That's just an entirely different role, really, and especially with how much Edmunds typically plays in the box around the line of scrimmage. I think that that's probably more likely to go to Killebrew for the time being, who is really the Steelers' special teams ace. But I do think that Trey Norwood gets involved a lot this year. And the other thing that's interesting to note is this happened a few weeks ago, and I think it was in the first preseason game, but Carl Joseph wound up on IR.
Yeah.
That really could have shaped out differently at the safety position for the Steelers had Joseph stayed healthy and maybe DeMonte Kazee got injured. Maybe the Steelers would have had enough confidence in Joseph to just roll with the healthy guy and keep him on the roster. And maybe they would have put Kazee on IR before the start of the season, which means that he would not be eligible to return this year. So the Steelers are holding out hope for Kazee for sure. We'll see if he's able to come back. We're hoping that he can get healthy and come back, because I think that he could be a quality depth piece for the Steelers at the safety position. I don't have nearly as many questions about the safety depth, especially when Kazee is healthy, as I do about the cornerback depth still. I still feel like the cornerback depth is scarier.
Because especially with Killebrew is a guy you can come in the box. Like, you know what he's capable of. He's really more of a linebacker, in my opinion, if you really wanted to pin a position on him. He's played safety primarily, but he plays more of a linebacker role. So that would give Edmunds a break if you need to in that role. And then we talked about Norwood. He can play all over the field. And you like that about him. He doesn't have to play one specific role. And I think that's why he was drafted and why he played even as much as he did last year. And you're right. I do think he's the guy that's going to be tasked with coming in a lot more this year than even he did last year.
Yeah, and it definitely hurts a little bit, at least in the temporary, losing both Kazee and Carl Joseph. I had to assume that one of those guys, like if Kazee was injured, the Joseph becomes the guy that's on the roster, at least temporarily, and can play the strong safety role. That's kind of what he was drafted for by the Raiders a while back. But so we'll see how that goes at the safety position. Minkah and Edmunds have both been really healthy in their careers, knock on wood. We hope that doesn't change. And so we just want to see those guys just continue on that streak of good health. And hopefully we don't have many injuries to the secondary, because we are a little bit thin there as well. All right, let's look at special teams, and then we'll get ready to wrap things up here soon. So special teams, no surprises here. Chris Boswell, the kicker, makes the team. Steelers gave him a massive contract this offseason, probably top 3 kicker in the NFL right now. Presley Harvin had a really good summer. He makes the team as a punter. And Christian Kuntz makes the team as the long snapper. So no changes to the roster over the last couple of years. Really done nothing else to talk about there. I mean, that is what it is. So
when you have a top, like you said, 3 kicker in the NFL and a hopefully rising punter, and a long snapper who doesn't really make any mistakes, because if he did, we'd know about it. That's pretty much all you ask for, right? Like, you can't get a whole lot better than the situation they have, especially a kicker, obviously. But
exactly. I want to note something interesting here. The Cowboys did something really interesting. I'm not sure if you saw that or not, but they cut their kicker and their long snapper, because their logic is, everybody's got their kicker, everybody's got their long snapper. Nobody's going to pick these guys up. They're not particularly great, but we're going to do that so that we can get some of our injured guys to start the season, stash them on IR, and then we're going to sign those guys right back. And so I thought that was an interesting philosophy. Obviously, the Steelers can't afford to do that. Their kicker's too good for that.
Yeah, especially
yeah. So that's not working for them, but I thought that was interesting. All right, let's take a look at it. The only thing I want to do now is let's just go back and recap really quick. Who are the players that we missed on? We did our 53-man roster prediction last week. And I have to say that maybe some things would have changed had I been able to watch the Lions game first. And so I think that might have been enough for me to flip-flop Jalen Warren over top of Anthony McFarland. But by the time we did our prediction, which was last Wednesday at this time, I had Anthony McFarland making the roster. He did not. Jalen Warren made the roster over him. I had Warren going to the practice squad. I had, let's see who else I had. I did not have Davis. I did not have Jesse Davis making the roster, obviously, because we couldn't predict the trade. I had Joe Hag in his place. And so we knew that there was going to be an offensive lineman there. We weren't convinced of who it was going to be, because we thought that a move could be coming either for a waiver claim or a trade. And so Jesse Davis threw a little curveball in there. I did not see Malik Reed for the same reason, making the team at edge. I just had them going with what we knew, which was Watt Highsmith, and then your backups being Derek Tuska and Hamilcar Rashed. And so Tuska made it, Rashed didn't, because the team traded for Reed. I had, who else do I have in here?
Buddy Johnson and Steele.
Buddy Johnson. Yeah. Okay, I got Buddy Johnson. I had Buddy Johnson making the roster. I didn't know that the plan for the team was to get Marcus Allen back after he's been injured, and I thought that they wouldn't give up on their 4th round pick quite so easily. And so I missed on that one there. And then Steven Sims, like, that one just threw us through a loop. Like,
that one threw us off a lot.
7th wide receiver. And so you tally him up. I had 5 guys that weren't the exact players. But if you take out Davis and Reed, I had 3 guys that I got wrong there with McFarland, Johnson, and Sims. Keeping that extra wide receiver there definitely threw a curveball. And so you want to share yours, Shane?
Yeah, so I also had McFarland making the roster, but I expected them to keep 4 guys. I felt like maybe they would feel that way Snell could just be the special teams guy that he's been, and the main reason he's going to make the team. So I was wrong on that, unfortunately. Same thing with Davis Reed. We kind of knew that, we didn't know that was going to happen. Obviously, that was unexpected, at least, knowing what players they're going to bring in. Johnson also, same thing. I expected him to be kind of like the 4th or 5th linebacker, come off the bench for, if Jack got hurt or somebody like that, we're more of a versatile player, not just a run defender or a pass coverage player. But again, I think he'll be back on the practice squad. I'd be surprised if he's not. Sims, again, 7 receivers, wouldn't have been able to tell me that. If you would have told me that before the season or right now, even prior to them doing it, like, they're not going to keep 7 receivers, even though it might be procedural. We'll see what happens with that. It still is interesting. And then Adams for me is my big miss. And that's just because, again, I felt like, they might have to make a cut somewhere else just to make up for the depth of their places. Davis ends up making the roster, and I'll gladly be wrong about that one.
All right, let's just finish out with one last question here for the day. What would you have done differently on the roster? Shane, let's start with you. If there's a move or two that you would have made differently than the Steelers, what would that have been?
I think there's really, I should say, 3 things that I kind of want to point at. McFarland, I would have wanted him to be on the roster, whether that means cutting Snell, whether that means cutting somewhere else, wherever it would have been. I really think that having a true different type of player at running back is very helpful when you're trying to throw defenses off. And I felt like Canada would have been able to use McFarland pretty well if he could stay healthy this year. Trading for someone other than Jesse Davis to bolster the offensive line, just because I don't know if it bolsters the offensive line.
Yeah,
that's kind of the problem. Is I get, again, he's a veteran. He has a ton of starts under his belt at multiple positions. I just don't think at the very least, if he's going to stay on the team and be a backup, I would rather him be the backup interior guy, not going to be the swing tackle. So we'll see what happens with him. And then honestly, Johnson, I think that he did deserve to, just because he's been healthy and he's been able to improve. I still think from last year, from what we saw from him, I would have liked to keep him on the roster if possible, even if it meant maybe Allen doesn't come back this year.
Yeah, I agree with most of those. I would say McFarland as well. That's one that, I mean, the guy got 3 carries last year. Like I said, three carries. That's not a big enough sample in my mind. You've got a young running back with legit 4.4 speed. And I watched him there at training camp this year. I thought he was having a really good summer. I mean, the guy was improving as a receiver, improving as a runner. He had the best preseason game of all the backs in the first game against Seattle. He popped off 8 yards a chunk. And so I wanted to see that different type of running back make the roster this year, a guy that you could do the jet sweeps with and put him in motion. Right. And so we unfortunately we're not going to get to see that. So that's a move I would have made differently. And you know my thoughts on Benny Snell. Like this guy better ball out on special teams because I'm expecting
he
hardly anything on offense.
Yeah.
So, and I understand why the Steelers did it. I just probably would have flopped those 2 players around. I think there's enough guys that you had make the roster this year that could have done the special teams work that you didn't necessarily need Snell for that. And again, a guy, I don't know if anybody would have claimed him or not anyway. So maybe just on reputation alone, but I don't know what that reputation is at this point. So that's one that I would have done. And I would also say like maybe even John LeGlue. Like I might have kept the guy around just because like, again, if we're looking at it on a level playing surface, I think LeGlue has just been better from last year until now than what Kendrick Green was. And I feel more comfortable about that guy coming into the game, who came into the game late in the season last year, started 5 of 6 games that he dressed for. And I thought he did a serviceable job, which is probably more than what we'll be able to see if we have to watch Kendrick Green in that situation. So I would have done that. And the third move that I probably would have made as well, I'm with you there. I'm not particularly keen on the Jesse Davis trade. And so I might have traded for a different guy as well, or kept Joe Haeg. But I also might have tried to trade for more cornerback depth. And that's just a position that it really scares me that if we have to see James Pierre play on the outside or Arthur Millette playing the slot for an extended period of time, I think that becomes another very vulnerable spot on the Steelers defense that we could really do without. And so I'm hoping that those corners stay healthy, like I said, but I probably would have tried to make some sort of effort to improve that cornerback room a little bit. All right, that's all that Shane and I have for you today. Thank you for joining us on the show. You can follow Shane on Twitter at Shayne Kubas. You can follow me on Twitter at Tommy Jaggi. You can download the Steel Curtain podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Also, check us out on YouTube. And thanks for listening to the Steel Curtain podcast.